When people are free to choose, they choose freedom.
She was in the business of liberation, the liberation of the proletariat.
Thatcher was a revolutionary radical.
The left portrays Margaret as an establishment figure, but she wasn't at all.
We were radical against an establishment which we felt didn't share the spoils very well or very fairly.
Margaret Thatcher was a subversive figure. We were a subversive government.
This is the story of a working-class revolution and the woman who led it.
Working class people were moving up the ladder. Suddenly it's guys coming in from Essex, not people coming in from Eton.
Free market economics has delivered prosperity on a mass scale that is unprecedented in human history.
Cortina man, Essex man, you name it. She understood their aspirations.
And yet, we're accused of looking after the rich. It was exactly the opposite of what happened.
This story is about how Margaret Thatcher stole the working class.
What really annoys people on the left is she started converting who they thought were their own people.
This is the story of how the new prosperity and influence of ordinary people offended Britain's traditional ruling class.
Suddenly these people who were supposed to be in the working classes are now driving nice cars, living in nice houses.
Selfish individualism is, I want something better for my children, I want something better out of my life than my parents had. If that's selfish individualism, roll on.
Ordinary people were going into the same grocer's shops as they were.
The Essex men, with their flashy wives and their flashy cars, were just talked about as if they were vermin.
This is a story about how the traditional Tory establishment turned on the revolutionary in its midst.
She was turning the world upside down. After all, they were conservatives. They didn't like change.
Thrown out by her own toffs.
The Tory party was taking its party back.
This is the story of Margaret Thatcher.
We will tell the people the truth, and the people will be our judge.
Margaret Thatcher is dead. Who will grieve and who will celebrate? My name is Martin Durkin, and I'm setting out to find out who loved and who hated Margaret Thatcher and why. The question is not as straightforward as you might think. For example, although people on the left clearly dislike her, it's not always easy to pin down precisely why.
You say we shouldn't renationalise industries, and you wouldn't go back to exchange controls, and you wouldn't reverse the trade union reforms. There are so many things that she did that people say they wouldn't reverse, and yet she's still hated.
Where there is no rationale for changing a main avenue of policy, why change it? There's absolutely no point in doing it. Mrs. Thatcher didn't denationalise.
So she was right.
No, she wasn't right.
What her friends and enemies seem to agree on is that the Thatcher Revolution, as it became known, changed Britain forever.
I was someone who grew up in the 1980s and watched what she did, very difficult decisions. And as I said, she was absolutely on the right side of the big arguments. And in a way, the biggest legacy and testament to her was that the governments that came after her, even though there were Labour governments that had complained bitterly about what she had done, they kept what she had done.
There is something topsy-turvy about the support for Margaret Thatcher. She was a Tory, and the Tories are meant to be on the side of the toffs. And yet many members of the traditional ruling class hated her almost as much as the left. She was even hated by members of the upper-class establishment in her own party.
The establishment on the whole were always very suspicious of her, the old establishment. The aristocratic establishment of this country never quite took to Margaret.
Margaret Thatcher was certainly not a member of the Bullingdon Club, let's put it like that.
Among Britain's high-minded intelligentsia, meanwhile, she was generally despised. Stephen Fry called her a shameful putrid scab, an embarrassingly ludicrous monstrosity who makes one ashamed to be British. Elvis Costello wrote one of several songs looking forward to Margaret Thatcher's death.
That song in Billy Elliot, "Every day is one day nearer to Margaret Thatcher dying."
The way that she was talked about, the way that she was hated and reviled by people who were so deeply threatened by what she represented, was one of the most shameful passages in modern British history.
And yet, by many ordinary people, Mrs. Thatcher was admired and even loved.
Out here in working-class Basildon, for example, among the shop assistants and builders and taxi drivers, you'll find some of her most enthusiastic supporters.
I think she was really good.
I really did like her.
I think she did the right thing for the country.
I thought she was the best thing since sliced bread, really.
She stuck to her principles. Not like today. There's no one around like her today.
I suspect it is people from what is sometimes disparagingly called Middle England who will be lining the route at Mrs. Thatcher's state funeral. They will be there not because she stood up for the toffs, but because she transformed the lives of ordinary working Britons. To understand how and why, we need to look at where Margaret Thatcher came from and the Britain into which she was born. So I've come to the market town of Grantham to visit a little flat above a corner shop where a girl called Margaret Roberts was born and grew up.
And here it is, or here it was. Now it's a chiropractic clinic and holistic retreat. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts lived upstairs in the flat with their daughters Muriel and Margaret. There was no hot running water, not even a radio until Margaret was in her teens. This was not a posh upbringing, but Margaret loved it. Later in her memoirs, she said, looking back, she realised what a thoroughly decent place Grantham was.
Margaret's father came from a family of cobblers. He left school at 13 and became a grocery boy and slowly saved enough to open his own grocery shop. He met his wife Beatrice at Methodist Church. Her father worked on the railway. They made a home in the flat above Alf's shop and had 2 children, Muriel and Margaret. Her father Alf was one of the great influences in her life. Margaret later described him as an old-fashioned liberal. He loved to read and loved to talk about ideas, and Margaret loved to listen.
The fundamental upbringing of her parents, and I think more particularly her father, never left her. And I think they made, just as I say her moral courage was the mark that her father left upon her, I think her entire being reflected her upbringing in Grantham.
The young Margaret played the organ in the local Methodist church, where her father was a lay preacher. Alf's liberalism and Christianity gave him a profound moral attachment to freedom. Freedom was worth fighting for and defending. When Margaret wasn't helping her father in church, she worked with him in the shop, and what she learnt here would stay with her the rest of her life.
Mrs. Thatcher said, although the left liked to depict capitalism as alien and harsh, to her, growing up here in Grantham, it was familiar and creative. Her father had been able to grow his business because he met the needs of his customers. He liked his customers, and his customers liked him.
It's 95 there.
Free economic activity wasn't a source of oppression, but a means of advancement. It didn't make us poorer, it made us richer.
The market was not a wicked thing. It was lively and human and sociable. She knew that it was international trade which brought tea and coffee and sugar and spices into the shops. It was international trade that brought Fred Astaire to the local cinema.
Alf taught Margaret well, and she won a place here at the local grammar school. In 1943, she was elected head girl. The young Margaret was bright, hard-working, and ambitious. At 5, she was playing the piano. At 10, she was reading Milton. And in her teens, she was reading heavy political theory, including books by communist authors.
In fact, she was so clever, she won a scholarship when she was 17 to study chemistry at Oxford University. So the girl from the grocer's shop in Grantham comes to Oxford University. How exciting. And she's desperate to take part in those famous Oxford Union debates. But she's a woman, and they don't let women in. She is able to join the Oxford Conservative Association, but immediately she starts to criticise Conservative Party policy. In fact, she writes a paper saying that, in the eyes of the public, the Conservatives represent, in her words, the prejudices and selfish interests of the moneyed classes. Radical stuff. But it went down well with her fellow students, who sent her as their delegate to a big Tory conference in London. And Margaret used her first ever conference speech to call for more working class involvement in Conservative politics.
At Oxford, for the first time, Margaret came up against social prejudice and snobbery. In an effort to fit in, she discreetly dropped the Grantham accent.
I don't think you could have been an undergraduate in the 40s and early 50s in Oxford from Margaret Thatcher's background without thinking it was a world of privilege, and of course it was.
But at Oxford, she discovered something quite extraordinary about the privileged upper classes. They weren't very keen on capitalism. In her memoirs, she said she found that conservatives from an elevated social background found economic liberalism alien and uncongenial.
I think the English upper classes weren't keen on capitalism because capitalism replaces status, replaces rank and hierarchy. The fact that they are so-and-so's son no longer matters because merit is going to take other people past them.
The Conservative Party had in it a very strong stream of the landed interest. People who were wealthy, inherited wealth, who were not very keen on a competitive world in which others might seek to acquire some of their wealth or surpass them.
People who made money and who didn't come from the right genteel backgrounds, they were the ones that class of Tories really feared and despised. Ambition itself was an offensive word. It was vulgar. It was crass. You weren't supposed to be ambitious. You were supposed to be there already. You were supposed to have either been born there or you didn't belong there.
Pictures like this always make you wonder if you may be looking at a future Prime Minister.
The upper classes were more likely to go into the army or senior civil service or politics than start a little business.
There was this big part of the Tory party, which was a landed interest, which looked down on trade, didn't have much time for commerce.
There was almost a snobbery about it, a disdain for people who got their hands muddy with the dirt of the real world.
The upper-class Tory establishment thought it was their job to run the country. Their fear of the market and love of state control drew many senior Tories towards a right-wing form of socialism.
Fascism is new to Great Britain. They turn to this new creed for salvation when the old world begins to collapse.
So the old aristocratic class were attracted to National Socialism because they thought that would protect their position.
Yes. It was those who wanted to keep things as they were who were sympathetic to the concept of fascism.
Leaving Oxford, Margaret got a job as a research chemist and met and married Dennis Thatcher, who came from Lewisham and worked for his father's paint business. In 1950, Margaret stood as Tory candidate in Dartford, where Labour enjoyed a huge majority. But Mrs. Thatcher, instead of mixing with the local knobs, went into parts of town the Tories usually avoided to canvass among the working class. The result was astonishing. She increased the Tory vote by over 7,000. Nevertheless, persuading the Tory party to give her a winnable seat was a monumental struggle. After all, she was a woman, and what's worse, a grocer's daughter.
She did have a tough time. You know, it wasn't easy for her by any stretch of the imagination.
Well-wishers besiege Caxton Hall, London, for the wedding of Britain's popular Foreign Secretary, Mr. Anthony Eden, to Miss Clarissa Spencer Churchill.
In the post-war period, the Tory party was still run by the upper classes.
Macmillan's best example, Alec Douglas, Hume, Eden, these were people from very posh backgrounds.
The upper-class Tory establishment agreed with Labour socialists that the state should directly control much of the economy. This was called the post-war consensus. The extent of nationalisation under both Labour and Tory governments was breathtaking. The ports and the docks and shipbuilding were nationalised. The trains and the railways, freight transport, canals, ferries and buses were nationalised. The airports and airlines, car, bus, truck and airplane manufacturing, The coal industry, the oil industry, the gas industry, the steel industry, iron, water, electricity were all nationalised. Telecommunications were nationalised. Much of the computer industry, radio and television were nationalised. The government even took over some pubs and the travel agent Thomas Cook. Britain, once the world's leading capitalist industrial nation, became one of the most state-owned of any country outside the communist world.
You might wake up in the morning and brush your teeth with state water, get into your state-produced car, avoiding state-produced lorries and buses. You might pick up your state telephone, phone the state travel agent, book a holiday taking off from a state airport in a state-produced aircraft, and so it went on. You could go through the entire day without ever contacting the free enterprise side of the economy.
Mrs. Thatcher, there's been...
Mrs. Thatcher was finally elected to Parliament in 1959.
Talk of the front bench. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we'll just try to be a very good backbencher first.
It was a grim time for Britain. According to the post-war consensus, nationalisation would bring prosperity. But instead, Britain suffered a period of rapid decline.
The problem with state industries was basically that being a monopoly, funded from the public purse, they didn't have to try. Private enterprise keeps itself efficient and cost-effective because otherwise people will turn to their competition and they'll go broke.
When you're working in an environment like that and you see it day in, day out, you can see what's going on. The management, what was looking after the works, just didn't care about the costs. They just let it go because they knew that if they lost money, the government would pay for it.
By the 1970s, state-owned Britain was on its knees, outdated and overmanned. The nationalised industries were making huge losses. They were not producing wealth, they were consuming it. Britain, once the workshop of the world, was now the sick man of Europe.
British Steel, British Telecom, British Gas, it doesn't matter. If it had the word British in front of it, it was basically nationalised and was completely on its backside. And it represented where the country was as well. The country was on its backside.
Turning Britain around would be a giant task, and it would fall to the country's first woman Prime Minister. In 1974, a small group of radical Tory MPs, led by Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher, decided that Britain was heading for economic ruin and that radical new thinking was needed. And this is where it came from. The Institute of Economic Affairs was established by two working-class radicals, Ralph Harris and Arthur Selden.
And one of Margaret Thatcher speaking to Ralph Harris. And that's Arthur Selden there. I mean, looking at, they're hardly members of the establishment. Not exactly members of the establishment. This is a few people from basically pretty humble backgrounds.
The founders of the IEA were joined by other working-class political activists. Alfred Sherman, a working-class Jew and former communist from London's East End, who became Margaret Thatcher's political mentor and speechwriter, and Madison Peary and Eamon Butler, who would help mastermind Mrs. Thatcher's privatisation programme.
It was a notable fact about the free enterprise movement of the 1970s that most of its participants were not from the traditional Tory class at all.
They're working class men, and men inspired by ideas, not obviously naturally within the reach of conservatism or the Conservative Party. Radicals, actually.
Mrs. Thatcher and the founders of the IEA were inspired by the writings of an Austrian former socialist, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek had turned against his old socialist beliefs because, he said, although socialism promised to liberate and enrich the workers, it had in fact done the exact opposite.
In Hayek, you actually have a former socialist who actually starts warning about socialism and sees freedom as the answer. Not conservatism, freedom. Free markets were helping the working classes, not oppressing them. That was the centrepiece of the new ideas that were actually going to then go on and guide the Thatcher administration.
There began moves among these free market radicals to stage a coup, to displace Ted Heath as leader of the Conservative Party, which was at that time in opposition.
There was a feeling amongst those of us committed to the free market persuasion that we were a revolutionary cell. There were not many of us, and we would ask of people, are they one of us?
In 1975, it was decided that Margaret Thatcher would stand for the leadership. The existing Tory leader, Ted Heath, had the support of the upper-class grandees. But Mrs. Thatcher appealed to the middle-class, rank-and-file Tory members. In her memoirs, she described her election as a shattering blow to the Conservative establishment.
A few paces from the front door, she met the first microphones and gave her initial reaction at becoming the first woman to achieve the leadership breakthrough in British politics.
Inside the old-fashioned Tory party was let loose a female termagant, they would say, who was conducting a guerrilla war against their best beliefs.
A woman leader was revolutionary. A woman leader with Margaret Thatcher's background was unheard of, and she led what I once called a peasants' revolt.
Margaret would never have been picked by the magic circle. There were people who should be ruling, and there were people who should be being ruled. And Margaret, I'm afraid, was in the second category, not the first.
The old Tory hierarchy may have been dismayed at the election of Mrs. Thatcher, but the Labour leadership was delighted.
Callaghan said, after her election, we've just won the next election. He just didn't believe that the Conservative Party, led by a woman, could beat him.
In the 1979 election, once again, Mrs. Thatcher directed her campaign not at traditional Tory voters, but at the working class.
The Conservative policy and Conservative Party consists of people who come from all walks of life, and the policy is for people in all walks of life.
I'm sure it's right that Margaret and I were much closer to the average person in the street than our predecessors, either in the leadership of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party.
What Margaret Thatcher did with the Conservative Party was to move her tanks right on to the Labour Party's lawn.
The result was the biggest electoral reversal since the war.
A huge crowd and a huge cheer.
The swing to the Conservatives was made up overwhelmingly of working-class voters. An incredible 10% of Labour's working-class vote switched to Tory.
Well, Mrs. Thatcher's now gone over to greet the crowds, shaking every hand that she can possibly get hold of. This is now the great photo call.
She was Britain's first woman Prime Minister, but anyone who thought she would be a soft touch was about to get a nasty surprise.
She was a leader. She would make up her mind. She would be determined and deliberate that you would always know where you were with Margaret Thatcher, and even when you disagreed with her, this was the order of the day.
It's quite some time since you banged the table. Is that what you're saying you will do this time if things don't...
I would have to bang the table, but I don't want to have to bang the table, and because I've banged it before and they know I will bang it again, there's less likelihood that I'll have to bang it.
I don't give a damn what people say. We're not doing that.
No, never. Margaret was very blunt. You always knew exactly what she thought, and she was straight with the British people.
I like to be straight, I like to be clear, I like to be honest.
Well, that's why she was so popular.
Her supporters admired her steely resolve. Her enemies feared it.
By the end of next month...
Mrs. Thatcher was determined to dismantle state control. Many in the loss-making nationalised industries would lose their jobs. Some industries, like shipbuilding, would shrink to a fraction of their former size.
The devastation that happened to those communities under Margaret Thatcher was remarkable, because within a very, very short period of time, something happened that had never been done to very large communities before. Mining, steel, and shipbuilding were devastated overnight, with no chance for any alternative to be introduced, no chance for retraining, no chance for shifting those communities towards something else.
Because of what Mrs. Thatcher and her policies and the people who deferred to her did to lots of people in this country who weren't really in a position to defend themselves, I have great difficulty in finding respect for her or for them.
To the Labour left, cutting subsidies to loss-making state industry was unforgivable. To Mrs. Thatcher, it was the first step to recovery.
It was failing. She actually had the honesty and the courage to say, this isn't a proper industry. This is make-believe industry. We're subsidising this. We're making it up.
She knew in her mind what had to be done. She knew it was going to be tough, particularly at the beginning in 1979.
I think when she took over in 1979, I think people were beginning to think that perhaps Britain was in an irreversible decline, an economic decline, and she turned that round. She was immensely courageous.
What she said was, actually, this is going to be good for the country. You're going to take the medicine.
And the fact that, on the way, people are going to revile you, that doesn't matter at all.
Mrs. Thatcher's battle with the left over state control was in essence a battle between two different visions of the working class. According to the socialists, the working class was oppressed, and the source of that oppression was economic freedom. Their idea of progress was to have the working class living in state housing, travelling on state transport, working for state-controlled industries. Socialists fought not to change, but to preserve traditional jobs and working practices, and working-class communities, as they were called. And in post-war Britain, until Mrs. Thatcher came along, they got their way.
It was so awful. You weren't going anywhere. Your parents lived in a council flat, you were living in a council flat. You had a crappy job, your parents had a crappy job, you were going to have a crappy job. Your parents had a crappy car, you're going to have a crappy car. Your kids, don't worry about that, they're going down the same road. We were basically North Korea, but without the hope.
If you want to be cruel about the left-wing worldview, it is in essence that of looking after the lower orders, and I picked that phrase carefully, the lower orders sufficiently well that they're going to be satisfied with their lot.
They live in their council blocks, they have fairly low-paid jobs, they'll never do much better, they're just struggling to survive and perhaps need to be looked after a little bit, but their prospects are really pretty grim.
The socialist vision of the working class offended Mrs. Thatcher to the core.
They think it's attractive to offer to the young a future wholly controlled by the operation of the socialist state. What is their message? To each his own pigeonhole, from each total conformity. We utterly reject it.
Charlie Mullins was one of the working class voters who switched from Labour to Tory when Mrs. Thatcher became leader.
This is where I unfortunately was brought up. I mean, that's a shithole there. Absolute carsy. My mother was a barmaid and my father worked in a factory, you know, so very much Labour people, but I voted for Tories because, you know, this ain't what I wanted for the rest of my life.
But the Thatcher-supporting working-class Tory was an object of scorn for many on the left.
Huge numbers of working-class people clearly liked Margaret Thatcher. How do you explain that?
Yeah. In the makeup of the British working-class Conservative, there is an element of deference, of order-taking, especially if they can be convinced that there are others below them that are suitably deferential to them.
There was such a large slice of people who were aspirational, who wanted to distinguish themselves from people who were perhaps a little lower than them in the pecking order. They were the charge hands, the people who were junior management, if you like. They were the non-commissioned officers of the working classes on their way upwards.
But to Mrs. Thatcher's supporters, there wasn't anything wrong with wanting to get on.
There can't be anybody who doesn't believe that, you know, we wouldn't mind a rather nicer car, a slightly bigger house, or a house at all. Or even if we didn't have the house. Have you seen my Tom's doing rather well? He's just bought a semi out in out Basildon way, you know.
In Mrs. Thatcher's first Queen's speech, she announced that people in state housing would be allowed to buy their own homes. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 had imposed strict limits on private house building. Instead, the state would build them.
Ordinary people who wanted a home had to apply to the authorities, who would then allocate them a house or a flat.
When this new block of flats in Plymouth has been completed, it will house 116 dwellers.
By the 1970s, a third of Britain's population lived in state housing.
At the end of their lives, they had nothing. They passed on nothing to their children. They had nothing to call their own except maybe a television and some furniture, and that would be about it. And what she did was say to them all of a sudden, you can own the most important thing in your life, your home.
Why do you need to own your own house? The house prices weren't going anywhere. You weren't going to make a big fortune. Why did it matter? But actually, it did seem to matter. So deep down inside people, they wanted something more than the state handing them stuff.
Rows of seemingly identical houses, but amongst them the badges of Thatcherism. New front doors in place of the old standard issue and replacement double-glazed windows.
For the first time, capital and passing it on to your children isn't something that a tiny minority of the rich can do. It's something that millions and millions of people who never thought they'd have any capital can do.
Some of the Labour councillors who'd been leading the campaign against us, saying this was outrageous and morally wrong, started buying their own council houses because they were council tenants. And when that happened, I said, we won.
The Hunts are one of almost 1 million couples who've bought their council house since Mrs Thatcher became Prime Minister. At the last election, like their parents before them, they voted Labour. But this time, they'll be voting Conservative.
Mrs Thatcher's policy of selling council houses proved incredibly popular. The Labour Party decided to change its policy.
I changed the policy in the Labour Party. Didn't have much to do with Margaret Thatcher. It had everything to do with Gordon and Mary Kinnock, my parents. I just thought it would have been a compliment to them and a reward for their labours had they been able to buy that council house.
Mrs Thatcher's policies didn't just prove popular with the electorate. At her election, The Sun, which had previously been a staunch Labour newspaper, switched to Tory. When Kelvin Mackenzie became editor in 1981, it became solidly Thatcherite.
In a sense, when you edit a newspaper, you have to be on your reader's side. And you would have thought, well, if you're going to start rubber stamping Conservative policies against the interests of the working man and woman of this country, what's going to happen? You're going to go down like that. And the Daily Mirror, the voice allegedly of the ordinary working stiff in the streets, right, it's going to go through the roof. In that period of time, our sale continued to climb and the Mirrors continued to fall. The greatest single moment of my life, every single day, was when I pass a white van and there, on the shelf in front of their wheel, there was a copy of The Sun. And that was without fear or favour, it was always there.
What really annoys people on the left isn't that Margaret Thatcher was a Conservative. In many ways she wasn't. It wasn't that Margaret Thatcher was working for the bosses. She wasn't. What annoys them is she started converting who they thought were their own people.
In the early 80s, although Mrs Thatcher was winning support from the new working-class Tories, her free market radicalism brought her into direct conflict with the upper-class Tory establishment, the so-called Wets, who still dominated the party.
Thatcher's internal struggle within the Conservative Party was epic.
The division in the Conservative Party did, as a lot of people have suggested, roughly follow class lines.
She wasn't impressed simply because someone had an estate or a castle or a title. She would be suspicious of them and think they were probably just against change.
She inherited a party and, above all, a shadow cabinet, which was rooted in the old ways, the earlier ways, the consensus politics of post-war Britain. And she was definitely uncomfortable. She was in a minority in her own cabinet, there's no doubt about that.
If you were to look at the cabinet that she took over, I reckon perhaps 2 of them had voted for her.
She had to work initially towards bypassing them and then finally beginning to get rid of those who were instinctively, naturally and culturally opposed to her thinking.
In 81, she struck against the grandees. In a dramatic cabinet reshuffle, she brought in key Thatcherites like Norman Tebbit and Cecil Parkinson, and she sacked leading Wets like Christopher Soames.
What kind of news are you expecting this morning, sir? Morning.
The old Tory grandees were horrified.
They just felt it was their duty and that their background qualified them to be in charge.
There's a rather interesting passage in her memoirs where she describes getting rid of Christopher Soames and says he clearly regarded it as being dismissed by his own parlourmaid. That gives you a sort of feel for some of the relationships at that time.
They just didn't think it was right that a grammar school girl from Grantham should be telling them they were no longer in the cabinet.
The old guard of the Conservative Party found some of the things she did quite distasteful. And they didn't like all these new sort of garages coming in, as they were called, the lower orders.
People like Cecil Parkinson, who was the son of a railway engine driver, and myself, who was the son of a house painter and retail salesman. This was just not quite what had been expected of the world.
Norman Tebbit was mocked by upper-class Tories for his Cockney accent. In the media, he was depicted as a working-class bruiser. To Mrs. Thatcher, he was just the man she needed to take on the unions.
Well, I had a very unusual background in many ways for an up-and-coming Conservative. I had been a trades unionist, a shop steward. I'd helped to organise a strike. I'd been on strike.
The unions were fierce opponents of privatisation. Concentrating industries into state monopolies had given union leaders enormous power, and they were reluctant to lose it.
Massively powerful trade unions who basically had the country by the cojones, and every time they wanted something, squeeze.
When it was nationalised, if they could just call a strike and they knew that they'd have the country to ransom, because if they didn't get what they wanted, everything was shut down.
And so the union leadership could call a strike without balloting its members.
Yes.
You had to be a member of the trade union to work there.
Yeah, you did.
You
yes.
had to go on
You
strike.
had to be a member of the trade union, otherwise you couldn't work there. And that's what happened.
That was what was killing British industry.
Yeah, of course it was.
From midnight last night, rail services used by more than 2 million people were shut down.
Mrs. Thatcher believed that union militancy, far from helping workers, was wrecking British industry. There was a great gulf, Mrs. Thatcher believed, between the interests and views of union leaders and the people they claimed to represent, and she knew whose side she was on.
It was the guys on the shop floor who were okay. It was the trade union leaders who were the problem.
The solution, said Mrs. Thatcher, was to give more power to ordinary workers and union members.
She didn't try to break the unions, she tried to make them more democratic.
Mrs. Thatcher gave union members the right to elect their leaders, to be consulted in a secret ballot on whether or not to strike, and to leave the union if they wished, without losing their job.
And there's no other way we could...
The new democracy didn't go down well with union leaders, but it won Mrs. Thatcher huge popular support, which was further strengthened by her victory in the Falklands War. Despite the pain of economic reform, Mrs. Thatcher's election victory in 1983 was the most decisive since the Second World War.
For Mrs. Thatcher, triumph was sweet, and she chose to share it with some of the people who'd given her a landslide victory.
A larger victory than I had ever dared to hope.
The Labour vote fell again, this time by 3 million. Labour's share of the working class vote dropped even further. It was the worst result for Labour since 1900, when the party was founded. Even among trade unionists, almost as many were now voting Tory as were voting Labour.
We have been treated with contempt.
Incensed by trade union reform and the threatened closure of loss-making pits, Arthur Scargill, the militant mine union leader, decided to take action. He tried and failed 3 times to win a strike ballot. In the end, he called a strike without one, and he organised a small army of flying pickets in an effort to cut the supply of coal to the power plants.
By this stage, missiles, including pieces of fencing, were being thrown at the police.
Our duty demands and the national interest requires that we see that violence does not pay and is seen not to pay.
The pickets knew what to expect. They'd been warned it could turn nasty, and it did.
It was a trial of strength between Mrs. Thatcher and Arthur Scargill.
Get in here to see what they're doing.
Scargill ended up in hospital.
Police said he'd fallen and hurt himself. Mr. Scargill had a different version.
All I know is that these bastards rushed in and this guy hit me packet head with a bloody shield and knocked me to the ground out.
If we'd lost the miners' strike, we would have been destined to be run by the trade union movement forever. Today, trade union movement, what is it?
With the threat of union action gone, Mrs. Thatcher pressed ahead with privatisation. Moving state industries into the private sector, she believed, would not just revive their fortunes, it would also spread wealth and ownership like never before.
The idea was a nation of owners, every man and every woman an owner, as part of the journey that we were going on, because we felt it was quite wrong that wealth should be concentrated in a limited number of hands.
Every man and woman a capitalist, she used to shout at me. Hey, that's what I want, every man and woman a capitalist.
The Tory upper-class grandees publicly condemned privatisation. Harold Macmillan, the former Tory Prime Minister, said it was like an impoverished aristocratic family selling off the valuables.
First the Georgian silver goes. Then all that nice furniture that used to be in the saloon. And then the Canalettos go.
The forces of reaction, or the establishment, were shocked by what we were suggesting.
I was told time and time again, often by Tories, no one will want to buy the shares, and you'll have riots, the workers won't accept it, and the standards will fall away.
Those who thought this share offer would not hold much attraction for the small investor were proved wrong this morning. Applications were arriving even before it got light.
All our push in our policies was to spread ownership.
Telecom's aim has been to get as many individuals as possible to buy shares. The stock exchange has never experienced anything like it.
And it was done in a most dramatic fashion.
Telecom says there's every sign that it'll be deluged with applications from ordinary members of the public for the shares.
Good afternoon, British Telecom share information office.
The response has been so great it's hired extra staff.
Smaller investors were given preferential treatment, while workers were encouraged to buy shares in their own industries.
The trade union bosses told their members that on no account must they subscribe for shares, and the members ignored them completely.
When British Steel was privatised, 94% of workers bought shares. When National Power was privatised, 99% of workers bought shares. Privatisations of British Telecom and gas were massively oversubscribed.
The forms are coming in so fast, we literally can't count them.
99% of people on the steelworks where I worked, they all bought shares. And it was a fantastic opportunity.
We increased the number of individual shareholders to 9 million.
If you had predicted in the 1960s that in just a decade or two's time, share ownership will be more common than trade union membership, you would have been laughed at. But actually, that's what happens.
As Mrs. Thatcher predicted, privatisation didn't just change ownership, it changed attitudes.
Everybody was encouraged to work hard to get the bonuses. It was
so you were sharing in profits.
Sharing in profits.
Part owner of the company.
That's right.
And it alters your perspective on it.
It does. It was fantastic. It was.
For the newly privatised state industries, there would be no more government bailouts. They made a profit or they died. The transformation was breathtaking. Almost overnight, the long waiting lists for telephones and gas cookers disappeared. Former state organisations, which had been dismissive and rude to their customers, now had to fight for their business.
So if you look at the productivity gains when you actually move something from the public sector to the private sector, in almost all cases, it looks like magic.
Not all the formerly nationalised industries fared well. Some, like coal and shipbuilding, had become so uncompetitive and dependent on government handouts, they struggled to survive. But freed from the burden of supporting loss-making industries, the rest of the economy took off. When Mrs. Thatcher came to power, productivity growth in Britain was among the lowest in the industrial world. Within a few years, it was one of the highest.
Britain was known for suffering from the British disease. Now we're known for having the British cure.
What is surprising looking back is how quickly the Thatcher Revolution transformed Britain. From being the sick man of Europe, you know, the once proud but now ailing giant which had no future, It only took something like 4 or 5 years to turn that around completely.
The message may not have reached the Labour Party, but it certainly reached our friends and competitors abroad. Despite the world recession, despite those long years under Labour, Britain is back in business.
There was a real British economic story that was then told the world over, and that was an incredible legacy that she has left us.
But paradoxically, it was the very success of Mrs. Thatcher's free market reforms which angered many people, not just on the left, but within her own party. As Mrs. Thatcher dismantled Britain's state-owned monopolies, opportunities opened up for new businesses. Plumber Charlie Mullins was one of many new entrepreneurs.
This is where it all started. I mean, this is when I was a plumber myself and, you know, going out doing the leaks in the middle of the night and that.
So what changed?
Once they privatised everything, you know, which was the gas, the water, electric, you know, and quite a lot of other major industries, it gave everyone an opportunity.
I can have something for the next half an hour. As soon as you can, please.
We must be there between 2 and 2:30 today.
This is our call centre, and we deal with a couple of thousand jobs a week in here, you know.
Half one now for you, so for 2:15, half an hour, yeah? Hello, madam.
Anyone that works hard and prepared to put a lot into it, there's no reason why you won't be successful.
Everywhere, new businesses started to spring up, often started by workers from the formerly nationalised industries.
One of the early privatisations was of bus transport in Britain. And of course it opened up opportunities for people to step in and offer innovative bus services. Now in many cases, these were people who'd been the employees of the state bus line and who'd worked out that there were better ways of doing this and ways that would attract more customers and make profits. And they did so. And that happened in many industries.
You get lots of people take a chance to make something of themselves, and it's utterly unpredictable, and even the people who do it are utterly unpredictable, because very often they're not people with 1 or 2 university degrees from good universities. They're people with no O-levels.
They are a Thatcher success story. Robin, who works for the Gas Board, now owns British Gas shares. Judy, a secretary in 1979, now runs her own office equipment company in Norwich. Her basic philosophy could have come straight from a Conservative Party manifesto.
The new world of opportunity for working-class people opened up even further when, in 1986, Mrs. Thatcher turned her guns on the old boy network in the City of London.
When Margaret took over, the city was still very much an establishment operation. In fact, people, the money brokers, used to wear top hats as they walked around the city.
That was the attitude in the city. You know, you were born to rule almost. Your father was a partner, you'd become a partner.
The old boys network, the public school network. You'd think that somebody who's supposedly a Conservative wouldn't tackle that. Thatcher tackled it from top to bottom.
The press called it Big Bang. In one fell swoop, Mrs. Thatcher swept aside the monopolistic privileges of the merchant banks. American firms flooded into London. They didn't care what school you came from. They cared if you could make money. And when it came to wheeling and dealing, the toffs discovered they were no match for the barrow boys.
You liberate the financial markets, and you find guys who might otherwise have been market traders in Walthamstow Market are suddenly there in the stock exchange, making megabucks.
This is a real revolution, and quite a working class revolution.
The city, instead of being run by the old school tie, was run by the barrow boys, and some of them were behaving in a flashy and vulgar way, and those of aesthetic sensibilities would say, oh my dear, it's appalling. But the point is,
they're working class lads with money for the first time.
But they're working class lads with money, some of them a lot of money for the first time, and they like to show it.
I'm making more money now, yeah. How about you? Yeah, I'm making more money too. Much more, or? Much more than I used to, yeah.
The Thatcher Revolution had created a brash, new, assertive Britain. The wave of new enterprise brought new kinds of jobs in marketing and advertising and sales. Working class boys and girls suddenly had money in their pockets. They started wearing smart suits, drinking in wine bars, buying nice cars, and going on foreign holidays. This was the age of the yuppie.
The spread of wealth in the Thatcher years is quite remarkable, right throughout society. Look at the way people dressed at the beginning of the 70s and they were dressing at the end of the 80s. There were more holidays, there was much better, and a great spread of consumer goods. It was a wonderful time to be alive.
The left originally criticised Thatcher for the poverty and unemployment and all the hardships that had been caused by her economic revolution, and they switched seamlessly to criticising the get-rich-quick, loads-of-money culture.
What was infuriating to a lot of Labour Party people, but not only them, was the absolute primacy of money. So the problem wasn't yuppie-dom, it was loads of money-dom.
On the left, there was a deep unease about people who were from the working class taking advantage of the Thatcherite reforms.
The left-wing comic attack on Thatcherism, it's all snobbery.
The loads of money character was a self-employed plasterer who'd done rather well for himself. What's wrong with that?
Well, I don't think anything's wrong with it at all, except that if you recall, the self-employed plasterer or other tradesman who was loads of money was rather proud of the fact that he managed to avoid taxation and regulation.
These are £13.99 this side. What does it say those are then?
To Mrs. Thatcher's critics, not only were her supporters lower class and vulgar, she was too. Jonathan Miller described her as odious and suburban. The Oxford philosopher Mary Warnock said she was among the worst of the lower middle class.
Well, I am having a look at it for Dennis. Just exactly that. It's beautiful quality.
When you heard that she bought her pussy bow blouse from Marks and Spencer's, it made you feel sick?
It was the blouse that made me feel sick, not the Marks and Spencer's. If Marks and Spencer's had a different kind of blouse, as they do, I wouldn't have minded, but it was this slimy material and bow at the neck. It was...
And not exactly vulgar, just low?
Low, that's right. Low. Low taste.
I mean, you're a snob, aren't you?
No. Well, I am. Yes, I dare say I am. But the fact is that there are lots and lots of people who are lower middle class who have marvellous taste. She wasn't one of them.
You get, I suppose, this snobbery that in today's terms we'd call a sort of Hampstead dinner party set, really. People who are pretty damned affluent consider themselves to be super intelligent and probably believe that they deserve a better lifestyle than the plebs, however hard the plebs are working. And they find Margaret Thatcher deeply troubling.
Unfortunately for Mrs. Thatcher, vulgar upward mobility, the rising prosperity of the workers, didn't just upset those on the left. The rise of the millionaire plumbers and barrow boy traders was also greeted with horror by the old guard, upper-class Tory establishment.
I remember being told in those years by someone who had good contacts with the landed classes how much they resented the social mobility that Thatcher had set loose. The fact that someone who'd made money from scrap metal was now buying a house in their street.
The wrong sort of people were making money. That's what it amounted to. It was perfectly all right for people who were genteel and had decent taste and were diffident about it to have money. But when people who were crass and rather vulgar and rather loud-mouthed made money, that was repulsive.
Margaret Thatcher's free market reforms had torn down the old-class barriers, and for this, she would pay the price.
Oh, dear me.
The Thatcher Revolution transformed the lives of ordinary Britons. Working-class areas like Basildon, which had once voted Labour, became Thatcherite strongholds. Margaret Thatcher had changed the face of British politics.
The left dislike her intensely, hate her, I think is reasonable. I mean, quite a lot of people want to dance on her grave.
Songs have been written to celebrate Mrs. Thatcher's death, parties organised, T-shirts printed.
Generally speaking, she is still anathema to Labour diehards. They can't still bring themselves to say a good word, because really she destroyed everything they believed in.
The left in Britain had not really been challenged in terms of their worldview for 50 years. And all of a sudden, she was hitting them in two ways. In practical terms, by taking the votes away from them, the trade union votes, the working class votes, and in idealistic terms, by taking the arguments away from them. So it's hardly surprising they resented her, really, is it?
It seemed that ordinary people were no longer convinced that state control was in their best interests. The Labour Party's traditional support was slipping away, and as it did, the character of the party changed.
She did change the Labour Party. Some people would say she changed the Labour Party more than she changed the Tory Party.
The Labour Party after the war had been a mass working class movement with 1 million members.
Then we should set ourselves the
But by the mid-1980s, membership had plummeted by nearly 2/3, and a survey of Labour activists confirmed that they were now mostly middle class and worked for the state.
What Labour had degenerated into is simply an axe-grinding lobbyist for the public sector.
In the eyes of many ordinary voters, socialism now simply meant heavy taxation and big public spending. Far from making them richer, it was making them poorer.
Socialists used to claim that workers were being bled dry by the bosses. But when working people looked in their wage packet and found that almost half of it had gone, more than half if you count VAT, they knew it wasn't the bosses who had taken it, it was the state. Socialism had been reduced to fleecing workers in the private sector to keep the middle-class public sector gravy train rolling. No wonder they were voting for Mrs. Thatcher.
They've got their eyes on your pension scheme and your life assurance. Oh, yes, you should know this. Put your savings in the bank and they'll nationalise it. Put your savings in your socks and they'd nationalise socks.
As far as Mrs. Thatcher was concerned, there was a new class struggle. The big clash of interests now was between tax producers in the private sector and tax consumers in the public sector.
Those parts of the country with a massive public sector and lots of welfare recipients continued to vote Labour. They wanted to keep the tap turned on. Those parts of the country having to foot the bill and rather resenting it were voting Tory.
Compared to the middle-class Labour left, Mrs. Thatcher's working-class Tory supporters seemed a lot less forgiving of long-term welfare recipients.
He left Scotland in search of a better job just after Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister.
I've had a couple of part-time jobs, and that was it. Yeah, a couple of part-time jobs.
But can you blame that on the government?
Yeah. Yeah.
I grew up in the 30s with an unemployed father. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he kept looking till he found it.
In an effort to win back voters, Neil Kinnock launched a new-look Labour Party. But he faced one huge problem. Without state ownership, it was now extremely difficult to define what socialism was.
My belief is, and was, that a socialist is someone who believed that the major economic and political decisions of any age should be consistent with the well-being of society.
But Margaret Thatcher's war against socialism extended beyond Britain, as Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev discovered at their first meeting.
Over the lunch table, she said to him, "Welcome to the United Kingdom, Mr. Gorbachev, and to Chequers. I want our relationship to get off to a good start. I want there to be no misunderstanding between us. I hate communism."
Together with American President Ronald Reagan, she set out to do what few people thought possible, to bring down communism.
Many people have spoken of the sort of natural chemistry between Thatcher and Reagan. I think it came down very simply to the fact that they were kindred spirits at the level of ideas. Both of them believed in enterprise, opportunities, meritocratic society in which people wouldn't be held back by class or birth. That, I think, was fundamentally why they got on.
She and Ronald Reagan together made this extraordinarily powerful combination. She meant what she said, in the same way that President Reagan meant what he said. Above all, they could see that they had won the ideological battle and that communism was a rotten system, as they said it was, and communism would never work. And this so undermined the morale of leaders of the communist systems in Eastern Europe, above all, that the end was inevitable.
Well, we've seen a tide of liberty sweep across Eastern Europe in the last 12 months, one nation after another.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. At home, nationalised Britain had been turned into free enterprise Britain. Mrs. Thatcher's victory over socialism appeared almost complete. But now, both the left and the Tory wets turned in hope to the European Union. Could Europe be used to reintroduce big government to Britain?
She said, I haven't changed Britain in order to find Europe, trying to put socialism back into Britain from outside.
In the end, it was the battle to resist Europe which would bring down Margaret Thatcher. Although Europe was the issue which sparked the events which led to her downfall, the real problem for Mrs. Thatcher lay much deeper.
Prime Minister, where did you decide to go?
The conflict between the Thatcherites and the wet Tory establishment had never gone away.
It was a sour government in the sense that there was a sort of canker at its heart that was eating away, or trying to eat away, at her resolve.
Behind this green door, a group of dissidents gather. These are the Tory wets, the kind of members who oppose Mrs. Thatcher, and some were not best pleased to find their arrival recorded by ITN cameras.
The party in Parliament ganged up to get rid of her, even though the electorate had always voted for her.
The Tories got rid of her. They literally politically assassinated her in very quick time.
People outside couldn't understand it. She'd won 3 elections, and this bunch of nobodies in the House of Commons suddenly decided to pick John Major, who wasn't in the same league.
The issue of Europe, which was finally the explicit reason why she was ousted, was really a very convenient foil for the fact that the Tory party was taking its party back.
Mrs. Thatcher made her first appearance around 12:30, 5 hours after making her decision. She left to tell the Queen in person she was standing down.
Well, in every sense, this is disgusted of Basildon. I'm shattered, completely distraught that we've actually removed from office the greatest Prime Minister of this century.
Thrown out by her own toffs. Incredible, isn't it? The idea that it wasn't a working movement that threw her out. The ordinary people never threw her out. In the end of the day, it was her own side that threw her out. People who actually had many of the advantages of life that she never had.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.
Was Britain a worse place after Margaret Thatcher left than it was when she arrived? Did she make Britain go downhill?
Did she make it go downhill over a period of 11 years? Well, I'll tell you what, with access to the figures here, because I'm not going to make claims that I can't back up, yeah, I could make the case that Britain's a worse place.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Margaret Thatcher said, "I have changed everything," and of course she was right. For the Thatcher period in Britain was no less than a revolution. It utterly transformed not only the economy of the country, but the lives of its citizens, and for the better.
That transformation, in a decade, in a single decade, I mean, historians are going to look back in a century's time and just look on in awe.
The remarkable thing about this is that the people behind the Thatcher Revolution aren't Tories. Ralph Harris, not a Tory. Arthur Selden, not a Tory. Frederick Hyatt writes a whole essay entitled Why I Am Not a Conservative. Margaret Thatcher really cannot be understood as a conservative. She's a radical, liberal, freedom lover. She's actually a popular revolutionary.
Thatcher was a revolutionary radical. I mean, one of the reasons many people saw her as the barbarian at the gate was she was not about privilege. She was not about helping out the upper classes.
She was in the business of liberation, frankly. The liberation of the proletariat, if you like.
She had been rejected by her own parliamentary party and was still despised on the left. But after she retired, Mrs. Thatcher remained enormously popular among many ordinary Britons. So much so that even Labour leaders felt the need to pay homage to her, and no Conservative leader would dare to criticise her.
The argument between, if you like, the wets and the dries was won by the dries because Margaret Thatcher was right.
Would you describe yourself as a Thatcherite?
Well, I was immensely inspired by her. There are many things that she put forward that I've continued, but I think it's up to others to attach names to Conservative Prime Ministers, either good names or bad names.
The passion of the Thatcher era and the sense of moral mission has gone. But what hasn't gone is free market economics, economic liberalism, because it won the argument. There's nobody who will argue against it now except a few nussers.
But in one important respect, Britain and the rest of Europe has departed from the path Margaret Thatcher would have taken. Gigantic government debt has caused havoc not just in Britain, but in the world economy.
To borrow and to borrow and to borrow is not Macbeth with a heavy cold, it is Labour Party policy.
Britain's national debt as a proportion of GDP was almost halved during Mrs. Thatcher's time in power.
Grantham said, no debt. You must not borrow. You must scrape by if you haven't got enough, save for a rainy day. That's very much the feelings that she had all throughout her life. And she believed that those are very important precepts to live by. She'd be appalled by the debt today, absolutely appalled.
If she ran the country today, it would be a better country.
After leaving office, the Iron Lady began to look vulnerable. It appeared that the strain had finally taken its toll.
The next moment, she began to fall forwards onto the podium, her head grazing the microphone. Police bodyguards rushed to Lady Thatcher's aid, easing her to the ground.
Over the next few years, she suffered a series of strokes, which made it increasingly hard to speak. And with the death of her husband, Dennis, in 2003, it seemed like the fight had finally left her.
She suffered a number of terrible losses, one way and the other, but the deepest loss she suffered was the loss of Dennis, undoubtedly. He was the great comfort to her, and even sometimes the slight check on her. Come on, old girl, time for home.
To her supporters, the slow, sad decline in her last years stands in stark contrast to her brilliant achievements.
I think her funeral will be a cathartic moment for Britain. I think that the people who try to stick to the despicable anti-Thatcher rhetoric of the time will find that they are completely out of the spirit of the country.
Do you think at her state funeral there will be many people lining the route?
I'm sure there'll be loads of people lining the route, and I think you'll have ordinary people there, from taxi drivers to plumbers to cleaners. Proper working class people will be out there. You know, they'll be out there in droves. You know, she's basically transformed Britain, and how some of these, well, arseholes can be going on about that, you know, it's good she's no longer around and things like that. It's just ridiculous. This is one great woman.
If it hadn't been for her, well, God knows what this country would have been in now. I hate to think.
Margaret Thatcher set out both to free the people from the constraints of socialism and to destroy the privileges of the old ruling class. A lover of freedom, herself from a poor background, she swept aside the old class barriers which had kept people in their place. And for that, she is hated and loved.
Thank you.
She comes from a lower middle class background whose father was a grocer in a working class area. She saw extremes of poverty. She knows those people because she's from those people, and she hasn't ever left them. So she doesn't feel that she has to approach them as if they're foreigners or aliens.
All the people who worked in Downing Street, the doorkeepers, the secretaries, the policemen, she knew everything about them and their families and took a great interest in them. I remember once being at a reception in number 10 with Mrs. Thatcher and her husband, and after it was all over, we were just talking among ourselves, and then she just said to the butler, "Come and join us," and got him sitting on the sofa with her and asking him what he thought about it and how it had gone.
I think one well-told story was worth telling again. When I was at one of the Checkers lunches, and in course of serving the meal, one of the waitresses there tipped some lamb gravy on my suit, and Margaret Thatcher leapt to her feet and was much more concerned to comfort the waitress than to console me. Quite right, but it's very characteristic that that would be her reaction.
She said to me, "Have you a car here?" And I said yes, and she said, "My driver's wife's in hospital and I've sent him to see her. Would you be prepared to run me and my security man to my home and then drop him at Victoria Station?" So I said, of course. So I did that. He went into the house, looked round, she went in, locked up. And I was driving him to Victoria, and I said, "How'd you get on with her?" And he said to me, "Look, in my job, I have to be prepared to step between the person I'm looking after and the bullet. And it doesn't half help if you like the person you're guarding. And we all like her." And then he said, this is something you mustn't use, he said, "I used to work for he said, I sometimes think it'll be one of ours who gets that bastard."
I was with her many times at party conferences and around the country, and she just liked going out and talking to people. And they rather liked talking to her. First they recognised her, which was always rather nice, and then she'd chat to them about their lives. And she was also very good with members of Parliament. She was always told whether one of their husbands or one of their wives was ill or their children were ill, and she'd make a personal comment about them. Now, I've known every Prime Minister since Harold Macmillan, and I don't think any one of those did that in the way that she did. It's very touching when the Prime Minister says, "How's your wife? I guess she wasn't very well, had a bit of an operation, is everything all right?" She would do that.
I think many people identified with her because her lifestyle was just like theirs. I always remember the photograph of her in Flood Street, just after she'd become leader of the Conservative Party, and a newspaper caught her opening the door with a brush in her hand, sweeping the doorstep. She got on with life. I remember sitting next to her in the House of Lords one day, and she said, "Oh, goodness, is that the time? I must go and cook Dennis's supper."
We would work away, and then she would say she must give us supper, and the inevitable shepherd's pie would come out of the deep freeze and be hastily warmed up, and we ate it. And then she would have this delightful habit of standing up brightly and announcing, "Now we must get back to work. Dennis will clear away and wash up," which always seemed to be a bit hard on Dennis. I used to try at least carry my plate out into the kitchen as a gesture. Oh, Dennis should have got a medal. I think he was absolutely marvellous. He coped with Margaret endlessly. He was her greatest fan. If you look carefully at the conference films, he was the first one to clap and shout and cheer. And he adored her and thought she was wonderful. And she was immensely loyal to him. I remember one night in going to number 10, and Dennis had one or two over the 8, and she took me by the arm. She said, "He's got a bit of guitar tonight, Kenneth."
Dennis Thatcher heard me say this, give this assessment of her leadership qualities, and he said, "I've missed one out. And you have missed the most important one, and that was a deep and abiding Christian ethic." And I know a young woman academic who firmly believes But what Margaret Thatcher did over her 11 and a half years of office was, quite simply, to implement her Christian beliefs.
The other aspect of Margaret Thatcher, of course, was she hated holidays. Anything to avoid a holiday. When she went, anything to get back from it. There was usually the compulsory first day photograph on a beach with Dennis and a borrowed dog, and then it was telephone calls of a sort of "can I come back now" nature. The one thing I remember her really enjoying was an annual visit to Salzburg. She was a great opera music fan generally, and would stay out there for 3 or 4 days and attend as many concerts or operas as she could, and that was the one, I think, real relaxation she ever, to my eyes, took.
Throughout this extraordinary period of achievement in government, this whirlwind of activity every day, when she's getting by on 3 hours sleep and vitamin pills and black coffee for breakfast, she manages to remain a very simple, humble, decent, kind person. She can be arrogant in rows because her temper is roused and she's fighting and she's battling. She knows the forces against her. But she nonetheless is a person who, in a personal sense, is not arrogant. She's a very humble and she has no great opinion of herself, so to speak, as a person. I think she's wrong about that. I think she's interesting on all sorts of grounds. But she's a thoroughly nice, decent woman, and I'm really happy to have known her.
I admired her for what she was as a person, and she was an exceptional person. We had an exceptional Prime Minister.
Not only did she bring about a certain kind of social revolution, making it possible for ordinary people to do better in life and to have higher aspirations, but she was in a sense also the embodiment of that revolution. She had done it herself.
At one stage, she said, words to the effect, I criticised for having too many old Etonians in my cabinet. And then she said there's Douglas Hurd, and there's Tim Renton, who'd just, I think, taken over as Chief Whip. She said, we want more people like you who've, in effect, made it up the hard way. You made it up the hard way, and I made it up the hard way. It was an interesting point, because up to that moment, I hadn't actually thought about the cabinet in that way. I hadn't actually thought about who was an old Etonian and who went to Harrow and who went to King Edward VI Grammar School as I did. I mean, it just didn't come into it. But obviously Margaret did feel that, and I suppose it's some indication of the fact that the old establishment, it didn't entirely kind of leave her consciousness, even at that point, which was in 1989.
The Labour Party may once have been the party of the working class and the poor and the aspirational. It has long since become the party of the comfortably off in the public sector. And that's what it defends. Nobody likes to say, frankly, I believe in middle-class privileges that are paid for by poorer taxpayers. That's my principle. Nobody likes to say that, so they have to find a lot of hocus-pocus arguments to justify it in other terms. And that's what the left has been reduced to, and Thatcherism challenged that.
She certainly saw thrift as a huge virtue. I'm always amused. People sneer at her attitude to balancing the budget and saving, and they say things like, well, of course, running a country is not like running a shop. Well, it's more like running a shop than you imagine, because I think it's been brought home to all of us in this crisis that actually there comes a point where you can't afford the interest on the debt. And you can waffle on about Keynesian economics as much as you like, but that is a reality that has confronted many, many people, and is even confronting the United States, which oddly is rather reluctant to recognize the reality of its own position.
We had never, ever, ever had a Prime Minister who understood, A, you can't buck the market, and B, leave the market alone. Never. Never. Macmillan wouldn't have understood that. Yeah, he'd have understood his stockbroker calling him to tell them, and all of that kind of thing. Ted Heath wouldn't have had the vaguest idea about what capitalism meant. He was a former news editor of the Church Times, for God's sake. I mean, calls him up and says that the deputy assistant bishop has just resigned. That's the biggest thing that will have ever happened to that bloke.
Accompanying her on her visits, it sometimes felt like carrying around an enormously, a sort of trophy, really. She had just attracted crowds when she went to the Soviet Union at Gorbachev's invitation, and he had said to her, "You can do anything you want." The first time this had happened for a Western leader. Wherever she went, she attracted these huge crowds. She got out of her car in the motorcades and so on, and walked the streets and provoked this enormous outpouring of people demonstrating, not particularly that they appreciated her, but they admired what she stood for, what she represented, and so visibly represented. So I think that gave her an extraordinary influence.
And what did she represent? She was so hated here, but she was so admired elsewhere.
Well, she stood for anti-communism, for destroying communism, for freedom of the individual, for ending the sort of societies in which they lived in, which they suffered under. And I think they believe what they heard from her, that she meant what she said, in the same way that President Reagan meant what he said, that actually things were finally going to change, and the disappointed hopes of 1956 in Budapest and 1967 in Prague were now going to be realized 40 years later. And it was very visible when she went to Poland at the very end of the 1980s, when they were on the very cusp of change, and solidarity was just coming out of the woodwork and being accepted. And again, the huge crowds who turned out to see her, you could tell they saw her as a symbol of everything they wanted and believed in, and they thought that she had some sort of magical power to help them achieve it. It was heady stuff. She was quite realistic enough to know what she could and couldn't deliver. But she was also realistic enough to know that she and Ronald Reagan together made this extraordinarily powerful combination.
She helped, as it were, the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact group. There's no question about that. And I saw that very, very vividly expressed when I went with her on a visit in 1990 to the Ukraine and to Armenia, because we'd given a school to Armenia, and I was the education secretary, so I went with her. And we arrived in Ukraine. It was incredible. She went and spoke in the parliament, and the whole parliament was waving big pale blue and yellow flags and shouting, "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." And when we got to Armenia, she had a sort of Pope mobile, a coach that she stood in the front of, but it couldn't get through the crowds. The crowds had so converged on the coach, they were throwing flowers in front of her. She was seen as one of the people who helped to promote and break up the solidity of the Iron Curtain. There was no doubt about it that the people in Eastern Europe thought that she was one of the people that helped them to become free.
I wouldn't see her as right-wing and the intellectuals as left-wing at all, actually. It seems to me that if you look at those kinds of formula from the point of view of freedom, who wants freedom? Well, the intellectuals certainly don't want freedom for the masses. They want the masses to be controlled, their better side brought out, kept away from harms, such as, the kind of entertainment that is degrading in intellectual point of view. Thatcher was on the side of freedom. Give freedom to enterprise. Enterprise will then give ordinary people their freedom to buy their council houses and so on. So, unless you just stick to the old left-wing, right-wing formula, it can't possibly be the case, it seems to me, that she is against progress and against freedom. She's the one who wants freedom.